Well, thank you. So welcome, everyone. My name is John Connolly. I'm broadcasting from Kensington, California. I'm the director of the Institute for Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies at Berkeley. And today we are delighted to have with us Peter Lippman. I'm going to say a few words of introduction before Peter tells us about his recent experience in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Peter's the author of the book Surviving the Peace, The Struggle for Post-War Recovery in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which came out in 2019. A veteran observer of social issues in pre- and post-war Yugoslavia, Peter has lived in Yugoslavia. Peter did live in Yugoslavia before the war and has lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina for several years afterwards. His main focus is the grassroots campaign for human rights in the post-war period. Fresh back from a trip to Bosnia-Herzegovina, today Peter will discuss life of ordinary Bosnians and the constraints put on that life by a dysfunctional post-war system. In that vein, he asks, how long does a post-war period last? What are the different levers of power that exist in the present system, and how have ordinary citizens responded to corruption, discrimination, electoral engineering, and all-around profiteering by the post-war elite? Added to that is the present political crisis that threatens, once again, to upend the social order. How are the different centers of power responding to this crisis? So without further ado, Peter, you are on.
Okay, thank you. That's a pretty inclusive introduction. Saves me a little bit of time. And 1 second, I'm fixing something here. Okay, yes, I would like to only add to that biography that I am a human rights activist myself and have been for most of my adult life, and that really colored my vision and my outlook in Bosnia, especially after the war, as I went there and lived from 1997 to 1999. And since then, I have been back in Bosnia now 18 times for extended periods of research and contact with people, the last one just ending at the end of September. So I wrote the book that John mentioned over a period of about 10 years, and it came out just about exactly 2 years ago. And I should mention that I have put up several what I think pertinent links in the chat space, including one that goes to my book, one that goes to my blog, and I'll come back to the others. So yes, the book was about grassroots human rights campaigns in the post-war period. And now coming to the title of the talk, I kind of randomly chose that a couple months ago. I have, it's true, often ask myself, what does a post-war period mean? What is the meaning of that phrase, and when does it end? When do we go to whatever comes next? And in thinking about that question for the purpose of this talk, I decided that you could describe the post-war period as something that's in the rubric of the Dayton Agreement, which was achieved at the end of the war in 1995, and especially what is the nature of the political system as defined by the Constitution, which is Annex 4 of the Dayton Agreement. So I want to address that, and I will also go to a few other questions that I've come up with. One being, what are the centers of power? How does power work in Bosnia-Herzegovina? I have been inspired to cover that with the help of some friends and almost mentors at the Democratization Policy Council. I've also put up their link in the chat space. I encourage you, if you're interested, to go ahead and look up the Democratization Policy Council. Another question is simply, what is the work of the grassroots movements in Bosnia and Herzegovina after the war? What is their response to Dayton and the hand of cards that ordinary people were dealt after the war? How has the dynamic of the Dayton structure played out in these 26 years since the war? And finally, I want to discuss the meaning of the term crisis, which is ever more frequently employed, first of all, periodically since the Dayton Agreement, and especially right now. Now, moving on, I do want to mention that the result of the war, at the end of the war, somewhere around half of the entire 4.4 million population of the country was either displaced internally or made refugees outside of the country, at least 1 million refugees in many other countries. And added to that, there was much physical destruction, somewhere around 500,000 apartments and housing units destroyed, and over 100,000 people killed in various ways. So now I will attempt to describe the Dayton system, sometimes known as the Dayton straitjacket, because it's such a confounding situation that's really hard to change and escape from. First of all, you have two administrated territories called entities, one being the Serb-controlled Republika Srpska, and the other one being the Federation, which is controlled by Croats and Bosniaks, that being the term for Bosnian Muslims in a secular or political sense. You also have the district of around the city of Brčko in the northeast, which was during the war a military choke point and always continues to have that possibility. It's a very strategic zone and has some different economic and political arrangements obtaining there. That's the district. Now, in these administrative territories, you have a confounding number of somewhere around 14 levels of government, 14 prime ministers, and many, many parliaments. In all, there are 143 municipalities. That remains the basic unit of administration in the Republika Srpska, I might say the RS just for short. In the RS, you have a number of municipalities, and then it goes straight up to the entity government with its own two-level parliament and its president and its prime minister. In the Federation, you have 10 cantons, geographically and to some extent ethnically devised. You have cantons which also have their own parliaments and their own prime ministers, and then you have the entity level two-body parliament and a president and prime minister. And then on top of that, at the state level, you have a three-part presidency with a Serb, a Croat, and a Bosniak. You also have the Council of Ministers, which runs the government, and you also have a two-part parliament right there. You have a united army for the whole country, which was established in 2004 out of the three remaining armies that fought the war against each other. Now it's one army. Now, about the Dayton Constitution, it enshrined the divisions that were established during the war, and unfortunately, due to, I would say, lack of foresight or perhaps even power on the part of the international framers of the Constitution, it left the people in place who had run the war, sometimes called warlords, the wartime leaders, ethno-nationalist politicians, their political parties, and their political descendants are all still in power. And so it also defined voters and inhabitants of the country as Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and others, giving power to the Serbs in the Serb-controlled republic to elect their member of the state-level presidency, and giving power in the federation to Croats and Bosniak voters to elect their members of the state level presidency. So what you have there is already a kind of electoral apartheid, which first of all excludes anyone who is not one of those three so-called constituent peoples. If you're Jewish or Romani or any other ethnic minority, you don't have the right or power to vote for somebody, to elect somebody of your own ethnicity to the state level presidency, nor to the House of Peoples, which is one of the two parliamentary bodies. Also, if you define yourself as a Bosnian, well, you're not allowed, you're not able to run as a candidate as a Bosnian. You have to be running as a candidate of one of those three ethnicities. So if you're in the federation, you can't vote. If you're Serb in the federation, you can't vote for a Serb presidential candidate. And conversely, if you're in the Serb controlled entity, you're not allowed to vote for any other ethnicity other than the Serb one. So this is a kind of built-in conflict that continues to this day. The Constitution in that way has enshrined nationalism, and people are defined by their ethnicity, not as citizens. In this sense, the Constitution gave the store away to the ethno-nationalist leaders who ran the war and still run the country. I want to move on a little bit to one more aspect of the Constitution, which is that given that if you're a Croat or Bosniak in the Federation, you can actually vote for one of the opposite ethnicities. So if you're a Croat, you can vote for a Bosniak candidate for presidency. And if you are Bosniak, you can vote for a Croat. And this has led to some interesting other conflicts, which I'll hope to get into a little bit later. There is, besides many things, aspects that contribute to conflict in the country, there is one element of the Constitution that holds the country together, which is, theoretically anyway, that all three ethnicities have to agree in Parliament for any change to the Constitution. This pretty much prevents any change to the Constitution. Now, I'm going to go on to the discussion of what the centers are of power in the country, and there are three pretty obvious ones. Again, I've come to a clearer understanding of this with some help from people in the Democratization Policy Council over the years. First of all, of course, there's the domestic political leaders who are, as I mentioned, mostly, overwhelmingly, the ethno-nationalist leaders of the war and their political heirs, and the nature of their operations is such that, say, if you are the president of the Serb entity and the best man at your wedding happens to be the owner of a construction company or an engineering company, well, it just works that that person is going to get an inordinate number of building or repair contracts, of which there are many in the economy throughout the country. Building roads, for example, repairing or building a new school or apartments, anything. Many of these contracts are established without tender, without competition. And that's the nature of the political leadership. I mean, people are stuck voting for those people, even though they know they're corrupt. You read the paper, you can see an instance, an article about corruption in every paper every day, but people don't really have the option, for the most part, to vote for someone who would like to promote a civic democracy with transparency. Now, moving on to the second center of power, that's the international community, a not very well defined phrase, but I interpret it to mean the centers of power that choose at any given time to be involved with the fate of Bosnia-Herzegovina. I should mention here at this point that in the Dayton Agreement, the institution of the Office of the High Representative was established, and that's in the person of a kind of viceroy or international governorate of Bosnia. That was established with Dayton, along with the Peace Implementation Council, which selects an international diplomat from one country or another to be that high representative, and that person, that office and that person is considered the final arbiter and interpreter of the Dayton, the civilian aspects of the Dayton Agreement. And that person is selected by the PIC. And there have been 6 or 8 of them. The most recent one up until the beginning of August was Valentin Insko from Austria. I'll come back to him. And then he was replaced after 12 years by a German diplomat, Christian Schmidt. So now that's one aspect of the involvement of the international community. And you could divide that into East and West, with the Western players prominently being the European Union and some, especially some of the more powerful countries of Europe, especially United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. And United States also being part of the Western section of the international community. Now, of course, then there's the East. Prominently Russia is what is the power that's concerned and interested in what goes on in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and generally from an opposing viewpoint to that of the West. China is also involved in some significant ways. The latter two certainly as members of the UN Security Council. Now I want to go to the third and relatively ignored section, or I should say center of power in Bosnia, and that is the grassroots, which is what I have really focused on for many years and written about at length. Now, I used to think I was cynical about politics until I moved back to Bosnia after the war, and I saw that people don't trust any politician, and they don't generally have a great feeling of the potential for their own involvement in political processes. But there are exceptions to that. There are always exceptions. There are always some people who understand that they have rights and possibly they have power if they organize themselves. Excuse me. And so it happened that right away after the war, with a massive number, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, these ordinary people with some excellent leaders among the relatively educated part of that population organized many local groups, associations to agitate for their return to their pre-war homes. I'm sorry, I have a little dry throat, so I might cough. People organized and agitated, they demonstrated, they blocked roads. They eventually formed, created tent encampments at places as near as they could get to their pre-war homes, say across the inter-entity borderline. And gradually, the international community took note. I must say, several years late, but started exerting pressure in the face of strong opposition, obstruction, bureaucratic obstruction to return, and sometimes direct violent, let's say low-level terrorism against return. However, by about the 6th, 7th year after the war, 2000, 2001, the return movement was peaking. Some things worked out. There were There was reclamation of people's property. And for example, in the Prijedor area, say somewhere around 25,000 people were able to return. These people are now called minorities or returnees. No one was ever a minority, at least not of the three constituent ethnicities. You weren't a minority if you were Croat, no matter where you live. But now, as a returnee, you are considered and treated as a minority. This is a big part of the post-war problem. And then say, for example, in Srebrenica, where first Serbs were displaced and then Muslims were displaced and massacred. After the war, eventually, late in the day, some 3,000 or 4,000 of each of the two ethnicities returned to that municipality. You also had significant return, particularly to the rural areas around Zvornik, Mostar, and Doboj. I've written at length about this again in my book. So this was an example of really just about the best example of grassroots action, of people understanding that they could take their fate into their own hands. And since then, there has never been an end to activism. It has ebbed and flowed and gone in cycles. And when it slowed down, it came back. It's still going on in different aspects today. There are campaigns to rectify what has developed into an ethnic-based school curriculum in different parts of the country. People have agitated strongly for memorialization, for creation of monuments and other ways to commemorate the war crimes that took place. There's been an ongoing fight against discrimination, because once you're in a returnee community as a minority, that doesn't mean that the leading dominant ethnicity is going to treat you with equal rights, rather the contrary. There was a successful movement back in the earlier part of the 2000s to abolish the compulsory military service, the draft, and this succeeded. And one of the more prominent ongoing campaigns today is for transparency in the resolution of some cases of street crime and murders of a couple people that have been covered up by the police, or maybe even perpetrated by the police, particularly that of David Dragicevic in Banja Luka and that of Djenan Memic in Sarajevo. And I go into this with more specific information because the day that I arrived in Sarajevo recently, September 11th, there was a demonstration of 5,000 people on one of the main squares against the cover-ups and for transparency and resolution of these criminal cases. So you can see that it's something that really strikes a nerve with people. They want to be safe. They want to know what their police are up to. They want resolution to these murders. And significantly in that particular demonstration, there were people from easily a dozen other parts of the country, including from Banja Luka. So this has come to be a cross-entity and cross-ethnic issue where people are significantly able to collaborate. There's also another campaign ongoing in general, much environmental activism, notably around Mostar, but many other places also. Now, again, I excuse the coughing. I want to go to the question of how the dynamic of the Dayton structure has played out over the last 26 years. And this could be a way of also asking, what is life like for people in Bosnia? And first of all, as I mentioned, really one of the salient aspects of life and politics is corruption, with non-tendered repair and construction projects, nepotism, politicians and directors hiring their relatives, politicians making deals in kafanas instead of going through any kind of transparent arrangement. bribery existing from top to bottom. And just an example here, again, in the Corona pandemic period, the health establishment and prime minister of the Federation, Fadil Novalic, engaged a neighbor and crony, the director of a raspberry agricultural organization or company based in Srebrenica, for some reason, to contact China and to buy 100 ventilators. This person, and is really this combine of people, purchased the ventilators, sold them at a great markup to the Federation, and it turned out the ventilators were not even useful in the dire hospital setting where they're needed. They turned out to be ventilators for emergency use in ambulances. So this is a scandal that has led to a trial. Prime Minister of the Federation, Novalic, goes to trial in the morning, maybe once a month or so, and then goes to his office and governs the Federation the rest of the day. It's quite a setting. All of this corruption and much more happens, of course, in an ethnically separated, ethnically homogenized setting, so that the corrupt operators deal with their own kind, but they also make deals with people of other ethnicities. And it turns out that the apartheid and the separation and the discrimination stops at that level. People collaborate quite easily. Another aspect of the political situation that governs the country and determines the fate of ordinary people is what they call the strankokratia. That means the partyocracy ruled by ethno-nationalist parties. When one party prevails in an election, it has the power to nominate, to appoint directors to the remaining state-owned companies, such as the energy companies, the mining companies, the mineral processing, aluminum processing companies, communications companies. So this was really quite a large part of the economy that the political parties have control of, as somewhat of a throwback to the earlier socialist period. And it gives the new directors, who are party appointees, the possibility to fire or fail to rehire members of the so-called wrong ethnicity, people who used to work at these companies. They are now unemployed, and it gives the directors the opportunity to sell off lucrative parts of the companies. And I could name easily a half dozen of these once prominent, powerful companies that are now but a shell. So given this situation, just wrapping this up, you have workers left in the lurch with nothing, no way to make a living. You have ethnic domination, party domination, discrimination, overlapping to the extent that you have to be one of the players, one of the operators, to have a good life in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And just as another on-the-ground example, I have an old friend who went to university, and you can get quite a decent education at many of the universities, went and studied criminology and graduated and was ready to become a police detective. But he was not a member of one of the parties and did not wish to join just for that reason. So he was not able to get a job, and he gave up and he left the country. And a couple other aspects of life in Bosnia I want to touch on. One is the situation with justice. The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia shut down a few years ago, having processed 160-odd war criminals, some of the big fish, and turned over quite some hundreds of unresolved cases to the Bosnian court. It's very slow going with those cases. There are thousands actually of them, and at least dozens of fugitives have left the country and resettled in Croatia and especially in Serbia, where they're living quite comfortably, sometimes greeted as heroes. And there are also people who were convicted of war crimes in Bosnia who went and served a few years' time. It's always astonishing to me how little time you can get for murdering 10, 20, 50, 70 people, and you're back out on the street in 10 years. Some of these people are out, and ordinary citizens, who, for example, in Prijedor, who were the victims of these people in concentration camps, are forced to see them walking freely on the street now in their hometowns. So the situation with justice is long delayed and, in fact, quite denied, not really evenly distributed. I want to address one other ongoing problem, and that is the matter of war crimes denial and historical revisionism of what happened in Bosnia and in other parts of the former Yugoslavia during the war. Now, people who committed crimes and their political sponsors and their political heirs have routinely denied, for example, that genocide took place in Srebrenica. This and many other aspects of historical revisionism are something that really are an affront to the survivors. It's an injustice, and it is a human rights problem. I hate to say it, but also there are people who consider themselves progressives in the West who have been participating in this denial and revisionism. And you can call on the world-class resource of the Balkan Witness website to see a quite voluminous source of information about these various deniers and the work of some people to try to refute them. This resource goes back over 20 years, and it happens to be administered by my brother, Roger Lippman. I've left a link to that site in the chat space. I hope you can see it there. Now, I'm going to move on. I also wrote one chapter in my book about that problem. I'm going to move on to try to wrap up this part of my discussion with high unemployment, high debt, difficulties in getting work, overall poor prospects for the future, for raising a family, for having one's children have a good time. One of the, having a good life and success in their life. One of the responses has been for people to leave the country, and they've been doing it since really a few years after they came back and resettled in Bosnia. And during my visit in September, I was told by more than one person that somewhere around 80,000 people left the country just in the last year. They've gone to places where they don't have to be bothered with judgment about what their name is and thereby what their ethnicity is. They can get a job and they can at least make things better for the future of their families. While I was in the Prijedor area and visiting Kozarac, I went to the village of Kevljani, which is known for being the location of a couple notorious mass graves. I was visiting a friend there, survivor of a concentration camp who returned a long time ago, minding his own business, tending his sheep. And he said to me that in that and two other villages in the nearby area, before the war, there were 1,900 inhabitants. Now there are 130. Maybe half of them are over 70 and only a handful of children. And he says that villages all around the country are emptying out. People are leaving, and not just so-called minorities, but for example, many Serbs are leaving from the Republika Srpska. So around that time, I was on the phone to a friend who is a member of the Democratization Policy Council, Valerie Perry, and I was saying to her, relaying to her something that my friend M. Suda in Kosarac had told me when I immediately when I met her. She said to me, "We have everything. We have water, electricity, schools, clinics. We have the fire department has been rebuilt. We have the library. We just don't have people." And you can see that on the streets in Kosarac. I said this to Valerie, and she said, "Did we lose?" And it was a question I hated to hear that. It hurt me to hear that because the truth of it made my heart sink. And for us to win, that is for Bosnia to be a place where people can happily raise their families, go away on vacation, and want to come back. Things have to be pretty much the opposite of what I've just described. There are people working on these problems, ordinary people, and a few good politicians, but it gets harder and harder each year. Now, I'm going to finish with one last section of my talk, which is about the concept of crisis. People are saying that right now there's the worst crisis in the post-war period. And I'll come to that, but I want to point out that it's a regime of crisis. 15 years ago, Milor Dodic, the head of his party, SNSD, a social democrat party nominally, became prime minister of the RS for a second time after several years away. And ever since then, he has cultivated his position of power and popularity among Serbs by appealing to the crudest national chauvinist, xenophobic, and racist leanings of those people. I don't want to say that Serbs any more than anybody else are racist or chauvinist, but this is an electoral and political dynamic that works in general. We saw it here in 2016, didn't we? And it has been working for 15 years for Milor Dodic, who has entrenched his position more and more over the years. And he started talking about secession of the Republika Srpska pretty much right away after he became prime minister at that point. Later, he became president of the entity, and eventually in 2018, somewhat ironically, he became Serb member of the three-part state-level presidency, always retaining and cultivating his power as representative of Serbs and as an ethno-nationalist secessionist operator. And in his 15-odd year tenure since 2006, he has managed to orchestrate a new crisis every couple of years and become quite skilled at it, managing to raise and lower the tension in the country like a symphony director, conductor. And every time there was a crisis, there has been some kind of weak response on the part of the international community, which just teaches him, as if he were a 2-year-old kid having a tantrum, that he can keep doing this, and each time he creates a crisis, so-called, he will get a reward. And this is what has happened. What it points to is what some people call stabilocracy. It's something you can observe in other parts of the world also, where the international community, such as it is, decides, oh, as long as there's not shooting, as long as there's not a war, we can let these operators just continue in their corrupt ways and their separatist ways, and hopefully it won't get to be too extreme. And that has been the case with Dodic and with Bosnia-Herzegovina for many years. Now, as to what he is up to, there's a variety of interpretations there, most of them leading to the conclusion that not only does Dodic work to stay in power, which keeps him out of jail as a corrupt operator. But most recently, it looks like he really means what he says. He's not just playing a game. It really looks like he is working towards the eventual secession of the Serb-controlled entity. Not that any of this can possibly be legal in any sense, but I'm going to jump now to July of this year, where the outgoing High Representative, Valentin Inzko, used his special powers in a rare instance to decree a new criminal law that said, no, you may not deny genocide in Srebrenica, and no, you may not glorify convicted war criminals by naming streets, parks, schools, and other institutions after them. You can't do that, and there are possible penalties from 3 months to 5 years in jail. So immediately, the Serb politicians and leaders of their entity said, oh, well, we're going to boycott state level institutions. If you're going to do that, we're going to boycott them, and there will be a political blockade until those laws are revoked. And so that has led to just about complete stoppage of work at the state level. Also, in Republika Srpska, officials established laws that said you cannot use the word genocide as in public pronouncements, nor may you make any statements that insult the Republika Srpska or call it a genocidal Croatian. So there was that, and also a threat to start abolishing the agency of any state level institution in the Republika Srpska, starting with the pharmaceutical agency, which has now been abolished in that entity, and it has started to create its own agency governing medicines and medical equipment. That was the first step, really, in a way, towards separation and secession. Secondly, further, Dodic's party, the SNSD, is promising to abolish the authorities of the judiciary from the state level in the entity, and to prohibit the state police and intelligence agencies from operating or existing in the entity, and most threatening that the Republika Srpska would create its own army. So this is pretty much a red line. I'm sure it won't be allowed by higher officials nor by the patriots of Bosnia. There is, in that sense, the possibility of a war looming in the future of Bosnia. It won't happen during this time of year, for one thing, because Dodic and his accomplices have said, well, we're going to do this, but we're going to let it happen, initiate this in about 6 months. And actually, springtime is when wars start in the Balkans anyway. I'm not predicting this. I don't engage in predicting this kind of thing, but it is a possibility. And it has alerted the international community to some extent in their own way. And they have, especially over the last few weeks, initiated a diplomatic offensive and sent envoys from the EU and from the US to meet with leaders on all sides in Bosnia. Notably, one meeting last week with an American envoy, Gabriel Escobar, took place with Dodic, and he came out of it. They both came out of this meeting saying, no, there's not going to be a war. We all agree there's not going to be a war. And then Dodic, immediately after that, announces, yes, we are going to continue to the point where we are going to create our own army. So there's no promise, there's nothing substantive to slow down this secessionist move and you hear something from the new High Representative Christian Schmidt, who says people must respect the state institutions and people must have a dialogue. And that's really not reassuring. Doesn't mean anything. Nothing really significant has been done to respond to the secessionist moves yet. Although there are threats of sanctions, nothing of that has been initiated yet. And Dodic, who, as I said, knows how to raise and lower the level of tension exquisitely, says, oh, actually, we are legalists. We are just wanting to return to the situation of the original Dayton and to the rule of the Constitution, which has been imposed upon by successive high representatives. So I think I'm going to try to leave it there. I'm sure there's more. I've left out some things. One aspect of the appeasement that's important but quite complicated is that Western officials could allow a change in electoral law so that Bosniaks are not allowed to vote for Croat candidates to the presidency in the Federation. And this would be, in a way, tantamount to allowing the creation of a third entity in the country for Croats, which would be, of course, ruled by the most extreme ethno-nationalists and profiteers, and would be another step to the breakup of the country. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. Let's have at it.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter, for that enlightening and somewhat alarming presentation. So we indeed do have a few questions that have come up while you were speaking. One from Harvey Weinstein. He asks, what lessons can be learned from Bosnia-Herzegovina about the role of the international community and NGOs in post-conflict states? Do you think that OHR could have asserted more, excuse me.
Dogs will do what they do.
I know, we happen to have wild turkeys in our street. It drives our dog crazy. Sorry about that. So do you think that OHR could have asserted more power in confronting the corruption that has undermined the development of the country? Can you say more about the role of schools in the rebuilding of Bosnia-Herzegovina? The gymnasium in Mostar maintains ethnic divisions in curriculum. What does this mean for the youth? And finally, is there such a process as pomirenje, reconciliation, occurring in Bosnia-Herzegovina?
Okay, good. I am a little bit acquainted with Dr. Weinstein, so I know more or less where he's coming from, and I'm in that light. I'm going to start with the last question. I think these are all great questions. About pomirenje, reconciliation. It's look at my book if you have it. Look in the index, and there are listings there about reconciliation, and I think it's really a very cynical thing. You could talk about reconciliation as something at the end of the asymptote of the processes of justice that aren't working very well in the country. There was a great quote from somebody in St. Louis, a survivor, an immigrant, which went, somebody has to say they're sorry. And very, very few people are saying they're sorry about anything, any of the crimes they committed, except if they're under pressure of imminent conviction of genocide, which is not really something sincere. And it's also something that's a fixation for foreigners, for international operators, for leaders of international non-governmental organizations, and especially people who come to lead seminars in the country. And these tend to be people who have an agenda that's not really related to real life of the survivors in the country, in order for there to be reconciliation. I don't even really like to talk about it, but because it is so far away. But there has to be, first of all, justice. There has to be a lot more of it. People have to see that the perpetrators have been punished, and that's only a small percentage of that has happened. People have to hear an apology, at least a recognition that, yes, I did this. Yes, this happened. Genocide happened. Ethnic cleansing happened. Mass rape and mass murder happened. And I want to do something about that. And among other things, also, people have to have something else to do with their time than to continue to deny and to provoke. People need a full-time job so they can realize those ambitions and hopes that I talked about before. With all of these things, rather the opposite is happening, and it's not a very hopeful prospect for reconciliation in the near future. And I would urge people who use that word to really consider what it means. Now, going to the role of schools in the rebuilding of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In a Serb-controlled entity, for the most part, schools where Serb students are the vast minority, you simply have the Serbian curriculum and an ethnically determined version of history, geography, political science, social studies, and many other things. These are called the ethnic or the national subjects. And so there are places where if there's a significant number of returnees, students are allowed to use their own curriculum, say, for those national subjects. And there's been a push against this by the government of the entity for quite a long time, and imposition of nationalist signage and names of schools named after Serbs who never even set foot in Bosnia, for example, or named after war criminals. And so this is an area where people in these return communities have had to assert themselves and fight for their right to study according to their own preferred curriculum. This even gets into the subject of language, what each group's language is called. Serbs call it Serbian, Croats call it Croatian. It's all one language, two different alphabets. And people have decided that a dialect is a language. It's not even different dialects in a given location in the country. But the Serb leaders of the school administration in that entity insist that the Bosniak language be called Bosniak when it's actually just Bosnian. So there's a fight about that also. Then in the Federation, there are separate curricula with in the Croat-dominated areas, the school curriculum being heavily influenced by that from Croatia. And in the Bosniak-dominated areas, it's simply a Bosnian curriculum, but there are places where there are mixed Croat and Bosniak populations living in the same area and having to use the same school building, namely somewhere around 54 of these, say in Mostar, in Bugojno, in Travnik, and some other areas. So they devised a system soon after the war called two schools under one roof. It's really typical Jim Crow situation with students studying in different shifts and even using different entrances to the building. I saw that in Stolac. And meanwhile, there's the question of what this means for the youth. And there are places where the youth, the young students have rebelled against this system. They meet their peers of the other ethnicity in the restrooms, on the playgrounds, and in the community, after all. And while maybe their parents or the politicized leaders of the school systems want them to be separate, it doesn't always work out that way. And in fact, in Jajce, another place where there are predominantly Croats and Bosniaks, you had a rebellion a couple years ago when there was a move to create one of these so-called two schools under one roof, and the students there worked to prevent that from happening. Now, going to the question about the OHR, could it have asserted more power in confronting the corruption? Well, for the first, let's say, 7 or 8 years after the war, the High Representative responded to corruption and to ethno-nationalist separatism, and especially to obstruction of return in a more and more robust way, to the point that where you had the British High Representative Paddy Ashdown for 3 years, firing in one swoop some 60 odd of these corrupt obstructionist operators. He was in office, if I remember correctly, from 2003 to 2006, and he earned the nickname the Bulldozer. And then the international community backed off. Then a new high representative came into power by the name of Christian Schwarz-Schilling, a nice guy who understood the situation very well and behaved as if he had been instructed to sleep on the job. And I believe he was instructed. He just about admitted this, really. It was, it was the initiation of the phase called transitioning from Dayton to Brussels. And in this phase, people were supposed to govern themselves in Bosnia. And there was not really any hope of that happening, but it's been in that phase ever since then, since about 2006, which coincided with the arrival of Dodic into office. It's been in that phase with high representatives doing less and less and using their special powers less and less, and local operators such as Dodic, but not exclusively him, testing the boundaries and moving further and further towards concentration of power and autocracy, and more outlandish expressions of corruption. Towards the end of his term, Valentin Inzko said, "This isn't working. We have to go back to a situation of more robust involvement of the international community." And the High Representative has never been able to really act on his own. He had to have support from the PIC, the Peace Implementation Council, and the support that he had from them would be a reflection of the attitude of the US and the European Union. And the European Union is really quite a different organization than it was 15 years ago, with the ascendance of reactionary ethno-nationalist powers among the members of the EU, especially Hungary and Poland, but not exclusively. And correspondingly, a movement in the EU, which you could call enlargement fatigue. It's been quite some years since any country was invited or welcomed into the European Union. The last country was Croatia. And the enlargement fatigue has really put a stop to, really, for all practical purposes, it's not a possibility anymore. Not at this point. There are many provisions that Bosnia has to undergo and satisfy in any case, really quite some hundreds of them, amounting to economic regulation and political cooperation and security provisions that it has not made. It has made precious little progress on. The talk is all there. Yes, we want to go to Europe, as they say. Going to Europe used to be something that felt like the equivalent of going to heaven, but people in Bosnia really pretty much see that that's not something that's going to be happening, although there's still plenty of lip service to it from both sides. Now, yes.
I can read the next question. This is from Andrei Milivojevic. Thank you for your talk. How would you describe the period or periods since Dayton's signing? Post-war seems inadequate, although open warfare has not resumed. Relatedly, do we see this phenomenon of, let's say, permanent post-war as sui generis to Bosnia, so limited to Bosnia?
Right. Yes, I think I've described the post-war period as well as I could in a limited amount of time. Calling it the Dayton system or the Dayton straitjacket is just one almost random way of describing it. It is inadequate, and I would like to mention three possible outcomes, which would signify the end of the post-war period and the end of the Dayton system. Really two, because another possibility is a frozen conflict, which is what you have now. And so it's not sui generis, it's not strictly applicable to Bosnia. There are numerous other places where frozen conflicts exist, say in the Caucasus, and I would say in Cyprus. And but the just long-term continuation of this frozen conflict with corrupt operations by many leaders of Bosnia, that would be just fine with them. That's what they want. They want that continuity. So a second possibility would be for warfare to take place, and then it's anybody's guess what would come out of that. And a third possibility would be the combination of grassroots activism, pressure from that side on the domestic leaders, and pressure from the international community, also on the domestic leaders, to change and to effect constitutional change so that there's a more transparent, less corrupt, and more democratic system developed. And unfortunately, at least from the international side, there's no indication that that kind of pressure is in the offing at this point of time.
We have a question from Dave Lippman. Are Dodic and his people left over from the previous war?
Well, it really varies. Dodic was an independent operator. He was a member of parliament from the Serb side, member of the Serb entities parliament. During the war, he was also a smuggler. He has the nickname of Milor Dodic, after his favorite brand of smuggled cigarettes. And I mean, really, anybody who's, say, over 40 is left over from the previous war in one way or another, but it's not that he particularly was in power. But on the other hand, he certainly represents the impulse of the wartime goals that were not quite achieved during the war. And so now they are being pursued by the wartime leaders and their political heirs by other means. And Dodic is one of those political heirs.
A question from Gaspar Mitans. What is your opinion on so-called non-paper?
Okay, yes, I am not going to be able to do a really good job of answering this. First of all, because it's a little bit vague. There have been, I think, somewhere around 4 or 5 or 6 so-called non-papers issued in the last 3 or 4 months. And what they are is it's kind of like when we say just saying, well, here's this and I'm just saying, meaning this is an idea and I don't want it to be seen as an official proposal, and I'm not even going to admit who wrote this, but one of them, probably the most prominent one, came from the office of the leader of Slovenia, Janez Janša, a prominent right-wing nationalist who it was delivered to the head of the European Union, Charles Michel, a few months ago, and it promoted roughly an ethnic-based reorganization of what we call the Western Balkans, so that it would unite Serbs with Serbs territorially and Albanians with Albanians and so on, and ultimately end in the breakup of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my opinion is that it's a really bad and dangerous idea, to the extent that I can specifically address that particular question.
A question from Nicholas Alexander. Wouldn't a war in Bosnia be an international conflict involving great powers and due to failure in maintaining relations among themselves more than it would be a local conflict?
I think this is a good question, and the answer to it is somewhat up to conjecture, as is everything that's going to happen in the future and the near future. But certainly what I like to say about Bosnia is it's a peripheral country at the whim of empire. And you can see this in other instances. You can see that even Ukraine, being a much larger country, it's at the whim of empire historically. You look back 100, 200 years, and you see that what has happened in Bosnia has happened as a reflection of regional, international, and imperial politics. And now certainly what is going on in Bosnia and the ascendance of ethno-national leaders, especially among the Croats and Serbs, is something that's sponsored by ethno-national expansionist leaders in Croatia and neighboring Serbia. And these are people, especially the president of Serbia, who is, as my brother David asked, is from the war. He was a nationalist activist during the war, and he has gained quite an autocratic level of power since then, and in some ways, while pretending to be a statesman, is also promoting the independence of the Republika Srpska. And there's a good amount of this same kind of influence from Croatia, promoting greater autonomy at least, and possibly independence, possibly even annexation of the Croat-controlled parts of Bosnia. Annexation was in the offing during the war, and people managed to fight this off with some help eventually from the international community. But the international community, I should say the Western aspect of it, has been divided, lackadaisical, distracted. And there are distractions, of course, but it has not paid attention. And when it has started to pay attention recently, it has not responded in an appropriate way. So yes, these are the tensions rising in Bosnia are certainly a manifestation of international relations. It gets played out as a local conflict. I mean, it's really up in the air what kind of war could happen if there were a war. Dodic wants he says, no, I'm not going to sacrifice the RS for peace, for the loss of peace by any means. And what he would like in his scenario is that now the Republika Srpska becomes a completely autonomous entity within the very loose framework of Bosnia-Herzegovina, whose only sovereignty is manifested in the international realm. And it's a way of secession in name only. So who knows, maybe if the international community rewards Dodic sufficiently, that's what'll happen. That scenario will happen. And it will be a continuation of the absence of war rather than actual peaceful resolution.
So we have a next question from Antje Postema. Hi, Peter. Thanks for this talk on your book. You touched briefly on ecological issues, and I'd like to hear more from you about environmental activism as a sphere in which seemingly new concerns and old concerns come into play. Work in this area seems to have a remarkable ability to bring together individuals, particularly young folks, who are committed to rejecting nationalist claims to people, land, and definitions thereof. But the terms of the argument seem to be the same as with many contestations in the post-war: control, grabs of resources after socialism, corruption, the problematic role of međunarodna zajednica, apathy, role of youth, etc.
Well, thanks for the question, Antje. And I think to some extent you answered yourself in that the threats to the environment are manifestations of the profiteering that I mentioned earlier. And of course, that's also something that's familiar in our own country and abroad. For example, you have the possibility of creation of mega projects such as hydroelectric dams. For example, one on the Drina in Serb-controlled territory, a dam that would be the result of cooperation between the RS and Serbia. And this is something that would not be legal because it's not been approved by the state level parliament. It would be a use of resources that would have dangerous environmental effects. And there has been some resistance to that. There's on the other end, there's a garbage dump in a neighborhood in Mostar called Uborak, where there's medical waste and other kinds of hazardous waste that's been overflowing. It was supposed to be shut down and months and months ago, and the communal agency continues to dump more waste there, and there has been quite an upwelling of local activism against that use, that abuse of the environment. And it happened that people who were demonstrating and publicizing this this endangerment to the environment were attacked by people, physically attacked by people connected to the local government. And it goes on and on. There are other developments, say, of natural resources and even natural monuments that are being despoiled, and people every time respond to that with limited success. So it is something that brings people together, young people, and in a cross-ethnic way that this is happening.
Next question is from Linda Bevis. How can we, grassroots Americans, best support grassroots Bosnians to thaw their frozen conflict and end apartheid, Jim Crow, and move to a more just and sustainable world?
Well, this is really one of the hardest questions because, as you know, Linda, people get mobilized in a human rights manner when there's a lot of bloodshed, people bleeding in some other part of the world. And we do need to mobilize. Well, there's a possibility to mobilize, and I think that it has to do with attempting to put pressure on our leaders and representatives, particularly in the State Department and in the caucus for Bosnia, in the Congress. Is it Bernice Johnson from Texas? She's the leader of the caucus. I hope I got that name right. And Secretary of State Blinken is somebody actually who, like President Biden, has a long time connections and knowledge about Bosnia, but apparently this is not preventing him and his envoys from doing the wrong thing at present. So letters and any kind of pressure to that caucus and to the Secretary of State especially would be one of the things we can do. Also getting in touch with the Bosnian Lobbying Organization Alliance for Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is active in Washington, D.C., is another thing that could be helpful, finding out what they're doing and supporting their pronouncements on the subject that have been coming out with increasing regularity.
We have a question from Claudio O'Callaghan. Is it possible to use the Czech-Slovak example, create 2 or maybe 3 new countries?
Well, it won't happen that way because that was a peaceful separation. And this one won't be peaceful, partly because the patriots of Bosnia are never prepared to accept the results of the genocide that happened in Srebrenica, and really not only in Srebrenica, but in numerous other places where it was simply not declared as such in court. But people who were displaced by the hundreds of thousands, literally, from what is now the Serb Republic, still considered that territory to be part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and currently they have free movement in and to that area, if nothing else. And I guarantee you that if there's a separation, there will be a fight.
Thank you. So now we have a question from Georgia Popovic. Thank you for your thorough overview of what is a difficult and messy situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I have a question about historical revisionism and genocide denial. You explained well what is at stake with local elites, that is the narrow political and ethno-nationalist interests served by historical revisions. But how does one explain the presence of revisionism among Western historians and public intellectuals? You mentioned it in passing during your talk, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on it.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. And do take a look at, for example, the section on Noam Chomsky in the website that I mentioned by my brother, Balkan Witness. It's really a sore point because the revisionism and denial of what happened not only in Bosnia, but also in Kosovo in the 1990s is something that has been practiced particularly by people who call themselves progressives or leftists in the West. The kind of mainstream liberals have no problem recognizing what genocide is and who's responsible for it. But then you have people, and I think this is a manifestation of punditry and a kind of ideological deterioration on the left, where you have people who say, oh, the United States is opposing Slobodan Milosevic, so we must be for him. That's kind of an extreme example, but former Attorney General Ramsey Clark was one of those who joined the so-called International Committee to Defend Slobodan Milosevic. There are several other so-called progressive pundits in the United States who most people have not heard of, who also participated in this line of defense of Slobodan Milosevic. Another one was Michael Parenti, who was rather a valiant leader of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. And Edward Herman, who was a colleague of Noam Chomsky's. And I have to say that some of these people were people I looked up to, and even sometimes still benefit from their analysis, but not pertaining to Yugoslavia because they got it wrong. They decided that the enemy of our enemy is our friend. In other words, they said, oh, as I said, the United States is opposing these people, and really the last remnant of Yugoslavia being Serbia and Montenegro, well, they were socialists and we have to support them. They were the last remaining socialists of Eastern Europe going into the 90s. And this is just completely a fraud. It, to a large extent, it replicates the Serbian apology for the war crimes that were committed. You can see this down the line. Even Noam Chomsky, who tends to be smarter and slicker than the rest and capable of doing plausible deniability at all times, actually sometimes repeats the fallacies promoted by the Serb apologists. I hope that has answered your question to some extent.
That's indeed fascinating. I wonder whether there's not also an element of would-be anti-colonial solidarity involved, right? The idea that American intellectuals have to stand with oppressed. This is not a question; it's just sort of a passing comment.
Well, the thing is, I'd love to respond to that briefly, and that is that there is this kind of pseudo anti-imperialism where Milosevic and his political heirs can point to the imperialists, which they have, legitimacy to that extent of saying, oh, well, these dominant powers want to determine our fate, and I'm not going to allow them to do that. And it is thereby a situation where black meets red, and where you have a breakdown again of allegedly progressive values, where some of these people, their anti-Islam, Islamophobia comes out. And there's nothing progressive about that, but it resonates for the proponents of apology and revisionism in Serbia. And don't let me get started about the resonance between Israel and Serbia.
Yes, let's maybe some other time. We have a few more questions. This is Juan Manuel Portilla Gomez. Do you think that Bosniaks are still the weakest ethno-national group? Don't they have any support from abroad?
Yeah, I don't think they're a weak ethno-national group, but the thing is, if we're looking at power based on ethnicity, I can't quite go there, because you have to look at power based on the elites, because they're the ones that have the power. And they each have power from somewhere else. I mean, political support. The Serb nationalists from Serbia, and actually from all the way to Russia and Greece and sometimes China. That's another big subject. The Croats from Croatia, and the Bosniak elites have support from Turkey, and this is a kind of insidious dynamic of one autocrat supporting the other. I don't glorify the elite leaders of the Bosniak community any more than I glorify any other profiteer and autocrat. So each of them does have support from abroad, but looking at the actual national, ethno-national group, it's a different story, and those people are confounded to some extent, divided and conquered, fighting against that. and they need to unite across ethnic lines and entity lines, and sometimes that happens, and that's where their power comes from.
We seem to have a question from a member of the Lippman clan once more, Roger this time. To follow up on Peter's statement about the concerns about war, sometime in the late 19th century, a German statesman said that the next European war would be the result of something stupid in the Balkans, which of course is what happened. How do you see the risk of the current situation exploding into an armed encounter between NATO and Russia?
There seems to be more Lippmans than you can shake a stick at. I think that there's the best example being World War I. A lot of wars seem to be something that the active parties back into. And so the question is not entirely answerable because you can't predict everything. But the West, as part of the international community, I mentioned distractions earlier. Now, one of them is the amassing of 90,000 Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. Another is the pretty wretched phenomenon of Belarus accepting migrants and trying to turn them loose in Poland, into Poland, and violence happening there. And so these are distractions that perhaps are part of the cause for an adequate response to Bosnia on the part of the international community, simply not being available. There are distractions, and I think that you could say that Biden thinks he has bigger fish to fry, or other fish to fry. And it does mean he's paying attention to Russia, and he's of course paying attention to China. We're hearing about that all the time. And Bosnia, he might make the mistake, and the Western part of the international community might make the mistake that there is, as another 19th century leader said, the Balkans is not worth a fingernail of a good Pomeranian grenadier. If the West decides it's just not worth it to go all the way and take care of what goes on in Bosnia, and as James Baker once said, we don't have a dog in that fight, well, that's going to be the mistake, and that can lead to anything. I do think, though, that there's really been historically now from the beginning of the superpower period, there's been an awareness that no, we don't want to go to an armed encounter between NATO and Russia. I really will risk a prediction that it won't go that far, but there could be some regionalized armed encounter if worst comes to worst.
Okay, thanks very much. So perhaps it's a somewhat hopeful note to conclude upon today. Before we do conclude, though, I want to remind you all of the title of the book, which is Surviving the Peace, The Struggle for Post-War Recovery in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is out with Vanderbilt University Press 2 years ago. Perhaps one more related question before we sign off from David Watson. Can you recommend any literary works that give useful insight into the conflict?
Sure. Look in the bibliography of my book, first of all. Secondly, a good overview is The Death of Yugoslavia by Alan Silber and
Laura and Alan.
Laura Silber. No, Laura Silber and Alan Little. Yes. Thirdly, to understand what happened in Srebrenica during the war, there's no substitute for Under the UN Flag by Hasan Nuhanovic, which I discussed at some length in my book, but that book has been translated and it's important to read.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much, Peter, for taking time out to speak with us today. This was a wonderful, enlightening presentation. Give us a lot to think about, and I'm sure I join the audience and looking forward to diving into your book. But with that, we'll say goodnight. Where are you? You're currently in the Pacific Northwest?
That's right. I'm in rainy Seattle.
Okay, well, we say sign off, say goodbye to Seattle and to the rest of you, wherever you are. One more word, Peter?
Yes, well, I do, feel free to get in touch with me if you want to discuss any of these things, and also do take a look at the 4 links that I put up on in the chat space.
Great. We've
Okay.
Okay, well, have a great rest of the day wherever you're coming in from, and goodbye again, and thank you, Peter.
Bye-bye.